There are moments that shatter you. Moments where the person you trusted most looks you in the eye and tells you that you are never enough. That your love, your loyalty, your very bloodline is a curse. For Serafina, that moment came on her wedding night. Rejected by the alpha she'd loved since childhood. Cast out while carrying a secret that would change everything. 3 lives growing inside her. 3 heirs to a power the wolf clans feared. But rejection has a way of forging queens from broken girls. And when prophecy demands her return, the alpha who abandoned her will discover that the fragile bride he discarded has become something far more dangerous, a Frostfire queen, a mother of legends, and a woman who no longer needs his acceptance. This is her story. The autumn moon hung heavy over the Obsidian Peak Packlands, casting silver light across the ceremonial grounds, where hundreds of wolves had gathered to witness the union of their alpha and his fated mate. Serafina stood in the center of the great hall, her wedding gown flowing around her like moonlit water. The fabric had been woven by the eldest women of the pack, embedded with symbols of fertility and strength. She felt beautiful when they dressed her, felt chosen, felt loved. Now, 3 hours after the ceremony, she felt nothing but cold. The celebration had ended abruptly. Alpha Allaric had gripped her hand, his touch gentle but his eyes distant, and led her away from the dancing and the music. She'd assumed he was eager to be alone with her. Her heart had raced with nervousness and anticipation. Instead, he brought her here to the council chamber. 6 elders sat in a semicircle, their weathered faces grave in the firelight. Allaric's father, the former alpha, stood among them. So did Elder Malachi, the pack's chief advisor whose eyes had always made Serafina uncomfortable. Allaric? Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. What's happening? Her new husband wouldn't meet her gaze. He stood rigid beside her, every muscle tense. The warmth he'd shown her during their courtship, the tenderness he'd whispered during their vows just hours ago, had vanished like mist in sunlight. Malachi stepped forward. He was a lean man, silver-haired despite being barely 50, with eyes like chips of ice. Serafina of the Frostfire line, he began, his voice formal and cold. We have called this gathering because information has come to light. Information that changes everything. Her stomach twisted. What information? Your bloodline. The words came from Allaric's father, Elder Titus. We have discovered texts in the old archives. Prophecies and warnings about the Frostfire wolves. Serafina's breath caught. She'd known her family was rare. Her mother had died when Serafina was young, and her father had raised her alone, teaching her to hide the distinctive silver-blue shimmer of her wolf form. Frostfire wolves were nearly extinct, hunted generations ago for reasons her father had never fully explained. My bloodline has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with this union, Malachi interrupted sharply. The ancient texts speak of Frostfire wolves as harbingers of chaos. Your kind nearly destroyed the clans 300 years ago. They wielded powers that bent the natural order. Powers that drove wolves mad. That's not true. Serafina turned to Allaric, desperate. You know me. You know I would never. Do you carry the power? Titus's question cut through the room like a blade. Serafina hesitated. She'd never manifested any abilities beyond the normal shifting. But her father had told her stories, whispered that when the time was right, when she truly needed it, the Frostfire gift would awaken. I don't know, she admitted. I've never used it. Uncertainty is not enough. Malachi's voice was final. We cannot risk the pack's safety on uncertainty. The texts are clear. Frostfire wolves brought winter and summer. They froze enemies from the inside out. They shattered pack bonds and drove Alphys to madness. Allaric, please. Serafina reached for her mate's hand. Tell them this is insane. We're bonded now. Fated mates. The moon herself chose us. Finally, Allaric looked at her. What she saw in his dark eyes broke something fundamental inside her chest. Regret, but also resolve. The council has advised that we cannot proceed with this bond, he said quietly. The world tilted. What? The word barely made it past her lips. I'm sorry, Serafina. His jaw clenched. But I am Alpha first. My duty is to protect this pack. If there's even a chance that your bloodline could bring harm. You're rejecting me. Her voice rose, disbelief and horror flooding through her. On our wedding night? After the vows? After the ceremony, the bond hasn't been consummated, Malachi said coldly. Therefore, it can still be severed without permanent damage to the Alpha. Without permanent damage to the Alpha. As if she didn't matter at all. Serafina's legs trembled. She wanted to scream, to rage, to shift and show them she was no threat. But shock had paralyzed her. This couldn't be happening. Allaric loved her. He courted her for 2 years. He defied his father's initial concerns about her mysterious bloodline. He'd stood before the entire pack and sworn his eternal loyalty. I, Allaric Black, Alpha of the Obsidian Peak Pack. His voice was steady, formal, rehearsed. Reject you, Serafina Winter, as my mate in Luna. The words hit her like physical blows. Each syllable drove ice into her veins. The fragile bond they'd formed during the ceremony, still new and tender, began to crack. Pain radiated from her chest outward day, searing agony that stole her breath. She gasped, doubling over. No one moved to help her. You will leave Obsidian Peak lands by dawn, Malachi continued as if she weren't standing there breaking apart. You may take your personal belongings and provisions for the journey, but you are no longer welcome here. Serafina forced herself upright. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these cold-eyed men who decided her fate without even giving her a chance to defend herself. She looked at Allaric one last time. Searched his face for any hint of the man who'd promised to love her forever. You're a coward, she whispered. His expression flickered. Just for an instant, she saw pain in his eyes. But he said nothing. Serafina turned and walked from the council chamber. Her legs felt disconnected from her body. The hallways of the pack house, which had seemed so grand and welcoming just hours before, now felt like a prison. She made it to the room they prepared for her, the Luna's quarters, before the first sob tore from her throat. The space was beautiful, furnished with rich fabrics and carved wood. A marriage bed covered in furs and silks. Candles had been lit, rose petals scattered. Someone had prepared this room for a wedding night full of love and joy. Instead, Serafina collapsed to her knees and wept. The bond fracture burned through her like wildfire. Her wolf howled in anguish, feeling the severing of something that should have been permanent. Fated mates were sacred. The moon goddess herself had marked them for each other, and Allaric had thrown it away because of fear, because of ancient prejudices and paranoid prophecies. Hours passed. Serafina wasn't sure how many. Eventually the tears stopped. The pain didn't, but it settled into something manageable. A constant ache rather than an acute agony. She stood on shaking legs and began to pack. She didn't have much. Most of her belongings were still at her father's cottage on the edge of Pack lands. But there were a few items here. The dress she'd worn to the courtship ceremony. A cloak Allaric had given her last winter. She threw the cloak into the fireplace and watched it burn. As she folded the dress, a wave of nausea hit her. Serafina froze. The nausea started 3 weeks ago. She'd assumed it was nerves about the wedding, but there had been other signs too. Heightened senses, exhaustion, and her cycle was late. With trembling hands, she pressed her palms against her lower abdomen, reached inward with her wolf senses, searching, and found them. 3 tiny sparks of life, barely formed, but unmistakably there. 3 heartbeats fluttering like trapped birds. Oh, goddess. Serafina sank onto the bed. She was pregnant with triplets. Allaric's children. The children of a rejected mate and a frost-fire wolf. Her mind raced. She should tell him. This changed everything. Surely when he knew about the babies he would reconsider. Pups were sacred. These were his heirs. But even as the thought formed, she knew the truth. The council would see her pregnancy as confirmation of their worst fears. Frost-fire heirs. 3 of them. They would take the children from her the moment they were born. Raise them as obsidian wolves, taught to hate and fear their mother's bloodline. Or worse, they might see the pups as too dangerous to live. Cold clarity settled over Serafina. She couldn't tell anyone. Couldn't stay. She had to disappear completely. By the time the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, Serafina had gathered her meager belongings and slipped from the pack house. The grounds were quiet. Most wolves were still recovering from the celebration, unaware that their new Luna had been cast out in the night. She shifted into her wolf form, feeling the familiar pull and stretch of the change. Her frost fire wolf was smaller than most, built for speed and endurance rather than battle. Her fur shimmered silver blue in the early light, beautiful and damning. Seraphina ran. She ran north, away from Obsidian Peak lands, away from everything she'd known. The forest blurred around her. Tears she couldn't shed in wolf form burned behind her eyes, but she didn't slow. The bond wound in her chest throbbed with every heartbeat. And beneath it, those 3 tiny sparks pulsed. 3 reasons to keep going. 3 lives depending on her strength. She didn't know where she was going. Didn't have a plan beyond getting as far from Allaric and his cursed council as possible. But as the sun rose higher and Obsidian Peak territory faded behind her, Seraphina made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would protect her children. And she would never, ever let anyone make her feel worthless again. The northern wilds were dangerous, filled with rogue wolves and worse things. But right now, Seraphina would rather face 1,000 rogues than spend another moment in a place that had rejected her so completely. She ran until her paws bled. Ran until exhaustion forced her to stop. When she finally collapsed in a small cave, hidden by dense underbrush, she shifted back to human form and allowed herself to cry once more. This time, she placed her hands over her stomach as she wept. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the tiny lives growing inside her. "I'm sorry your father is a coward. I'm sorry you'll grow up without a pack. But I promise you this, I will love you enough for an entire clan. I will protect you with everything I am. And I will make sure you never feel the pain of rejection." Outside the cave, wind whispered through the trees. And deep in Seraphina's chest, beneath the agony of the broken bond, something else stirred. Something cold and ancient. Something that had been sleeping for generations. Her frost fire power awakening at last. Now, what would rise from the ashes of her rejection? A broken wolf. Or something the clans had never seen before. 3 months had passed since Seraphina fled Obsidian Peak. 3 months of surviving in the harshest territories the Wolflands had to offer. The northern wilds lived up to their name. These forests were thick and tangled, the terrain rough and unforgiving. Winter came early here, and even in late autumn, frost coated the ground each morning. Seraphina had found shelter in a series of caves near a frozen stream. The largest cave went deep into the hillside, protected from wind and hidden by a waterfall that had partially frozen into sheets of ice. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. And safety mattered more than comfort now. She ran her hand over her swelling belly. At 3 months, the pregnancy was starting to show. Her wolf metabolism meant she was developing faster than a human would. The triplets were strong. She could feel them moving sometimes, gentle flutters that filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. "Good morning, little ones," she whispered. She'd taken to talking to them. It helped with loneliness. In 3 months she hadn't seen another soul. Hadn't wanted to. Out here, she was beyond pack politics and prophecies. Out here, no one could take her children. Seraphina forced herself to stand. Mornings were the hardest. The bond wounds still ached, though the sharp agony had faded to a dull throb. She'd heard that rejected mates sometimes died from the pain. Others went mad. But she was still here, still fighting for them. She gathered her cloak fashioned from furs she'd hunted and cured herself and stepped out of the cave. The morning air bit at her skin. Snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in white. Hunting was becoming more difficult as her pregnancy progressed. She tired easily now. But the triplets demanded food, and she refused to let them go hungry. Seraphina shifted into her wolf form and began to track. Her frost fire wolf moved silently through the snow, nose low, searching for prey. She'd become a better hunter in these months than she'd ever been in Obsidian Peak. Necessity had sharpened her skills. She caught the scent of a rabbit and followed it to a small warren. Patience. Stillness. Then the strike. The hunt was quick and clean. Seraphina carried her kill back to the cave and shifted to prepare it. As she worked, skinning and preserving the meat, she felt that strange stirring again. The power. It had been growing stronger. Sometimes her breath misted even when the air wasn't cold. Sometimes frost spread from her fingertips when she was angry or afraid. She didn't understand it. Didn't know how to control it. But it was there, undeniable. Her father's stories had been true. The frost fire gift was real. Serafina had just finished storing the meat when she heard voices. She froze. Voices meant other wolves, and other wolves meant danger. Quickly, she doused her small fire and retreated deeper into the cave. Heart pounding, she placed a protective hand over her belly. The triplets stirred as if sensing her fear. "Please be quiet," she breathed. "Please." The voices grew closer. 2 of them. Male. Rough. "I'm telling you, I saw smoke earlier," one said. "Out here? You're imagining things." The second voice was dismissive. "No, look. Tracks. Fresh ones." Serafina's pulse raced. She'd been so careful, but apparently not careful enough. She heard footsteps at the cave entrance, saw shadows moving against the ice-covered waterfall. "Someone's definitely been here," the first voice said. "The snow's been cleared, and that's a fire pit. Could be a rogue, or could be something worth taking." Serafina's hands curled into fists. She was trapped. The cave had only one entrance, and these wolves were blocking it. If she tried to run, they'd catch her. And in her condition, she couldn't fight. Unless... That cold power stirred in her chest, waiting. Ready. The 2 wolves entered the cave. They were both large men, dressed in mismatched furs and carrying crude weapons. Rogues. Packless wolves who survived by scavenging and stealing. The taller one spotted her first. Well, he said, grinning. "What do we have here?" Serafina stood her ground. "Leave now." The shorter rogue laughed. "She's got spirit. I like that." "Leave," Serafina repeated. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't want trouble." "Too bad." The tall one stepped closer. "You're on rogue territory now, sweetheart. And everything here belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it." His eyes raked over her, and Serafina saw the moment he noticed her pregnancy. His grin widened. "Oh, this just got interesting. Knocked up and all alone. Someone must have really wanted to get rid of you." Rage flooded through Serafina, hot and fierce and absolute. How dare he? How dare they come into her shelter, threaten her, mock her situation? "Last warning," she said quietly. "Leave, or I will make you leave." The rogues exchanged amused glances. "You in what pack?" the shorter one asked. Serafina didn't answer with words. She let the power rise. Frost spread from her feet in a rapidly expanding circle. The temperature in the cave plummeted. Her breath came out in clouds of vapor, and her eyes began to glow with pale blue light. The rogue's amusement vanished. With the tall one stumbled backward. Serafina raised her hand, and ice crystals formed in the air around her. They swirled like a miniature blizzard, sharpened, glittering. "I am Frostfire," she said, and her voice echoed strangely. "And you have made a fatal mistake." The power erupted. I shot from her palms in jagged spears. The rogues barely had time to scream before frost engulfed them. It didn't kill them, Serafina realized distantly, but it froze them in place, encased them in ice from the waist down. They stared at her in absolute terror. Serafina stared back, shocked by what she'd just done. The power receded as quickly as it had come, leaving her gasping. The blue light faded from her eyes, but the ice remained. "Go," she whispered. "Break free if you can. And go tell every rogue in these woods that this territory is claimed. Tell them the Frost Fire Wolf is here, and she will show no mercy to those who threaten her." The ice cracked. The rogues wrenched themselves free and ran, crashing through the cave entrance in their panic. Serafina sank to her knees. Her hands were shaking. The cave was still freezing, frost coating every surface. She'd done that. She'd wielded a power she didn't understand and had nearly killed 2 wolves. But they would have hurt her. Would have hurt her babies. She placed her hands on her stomach again. The triplets were moving, agitated by the surge of energy. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're okay. Mama kept us safe." But she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. If rogues had found her, others would too. Word would spread. And eventually, someone would come who wasn't frightened by a little ice, unless she made them too terrified to try. Over the following weeks, more rogues appeared. Some were curious about the rumors of a Frostfire wolf. Others came looking for easy prey. All of them learned the same lesson. Serafina showed no mercy. She didn't kill, but she didn't have to. A demonstration of her power was enough. Wolves who came with violence left with frostbitten tails of a silver blue she-wolf who commanded winter itself. But others came for different reasons. The first was a young female named Mira. She appeared at the cave entrance one evening, hands raised in peace. "I don't mean any harm," Mira called out. I heard there was a safe place here. For wolves who don't belong anywhere else." Serafina studied her warily. Mira was thin, her clothes ragged. She looked exhausted and scared. "Who rejected you?" Serafina asked quietly. Mira's eyes widened. "How did you?" "I know the look." Serafina stepped aside. "Come in. There's Stu." That night, around a small fire, Mira told her story. She'd been cast out from her pack for refusing to mate with the male her alpha had chosen. When she'd run, they'd branded her a rogue and sent hunters after her. "I've been running for 2 months," Mira said softly. "I'm so tired." Serafina understood that exhaustion in her bones. "You can stay," she said, "if you want. I could use the help. And the company." Mira's eyes filled with tears. "Really?" "Really. But you need to understand something." Serafina met her gaze. "I'm pregnant with triplets. And when they're born, they'll be the first priority. If you have any problem with that." "I don't," Mira smiled. "I think it's beautiful. You're very brave." Brave wasn't the word Serafina would have chosen, but she accepted the compliment. Others followed. An older male named Jax, scarred and bitter, who'd been exiled for speaking against his alpha's corruption. A pair of siblings, Tove and Rune, orphaned when their pack was destroyed by a territorial war. One by one, the outcast found their way to Serafina's cave. And one by one, she welcomed them. It wasn't a pack. Not officially. Just a loose collection of wolves who had nowhere else to go. But they helped each other, hunted together, shared resources and stories. And they looked to Serafina. She hadn't asked for leadership, but it settled on her shoulders naturally. Maybe because she'd been the first. Maybe because of her power, which she used to protect them when danger came. Or maybe because she understood what it meant to be cast out, and had decided that no one under her protection would ever feel that way again. By the time Serafina reached her 6th month of pregnancy, there were 12 wolves living in the network of caves. They fortified the area, created stores of food for the coming winter, and established a perimeter. "We need a name," Jax said one night. "The other rogues are calling us something. We should claim it ourselves." "What are they calling us?" Serafina asked. "The Crystal Veil Pack." Serafina considered. The pack. The words still hurt. She'd been rejected by one pack already. Did she really want to build another? But as she looked around the fire at these wolves who'd become her family, she realized something. This wasn't like Obsidian Peak. This was hers. "Then that's what we are," she said. "Crystal Veil. A place for the rejected, the forgotten, the ones the other packs threw away." Mira raised a cup of herb tea. "To Crystal Veil. To Crystal Veil," the others echoed. That night, Serafina lay in her sleeping furs, hands on her enormous belly, and felt the triplets moving. They were strong, active, fighting each other for space. She smiled. "Your pack is growing," she whispered to them. "And when you're born, you'll have a family waiting. Not the family I planned for you, but maybe a better one." Outside, snow began to fall again, and in the distance, so far south that Serafina couldn't possibly have heard it, Alpha Allaric Black stood on the balcony of his pack house and stared into the northern darkness, wondering, not for the first time, if he'd made the worst mistake of his life. The labor started on the coldest night of winter. Serafina woke to cramping pain that stole her breath. She bit back a scream, not wanting to wake the others. But Mira, who'd been sleeping nearby, was at her side instantly. "It's time?" Mira asked. Serafina could only nod. Within minutes, the entire Crystal Veil pack was awake. The women took charge immediately. They'd been preparing for this for weeks. Mira and Tove had gathered herbs and made a birthing nest in the deepest, warmest part of the cave system. "You're going to be fine," Mira said firmly as she helped Serafina walk. "We've got you." The labor lasted 12 hours. 12 hours of agony that made the bond rejection feel like a gentle ache in comparison. Seraphina screamed, cursed, begged for it to end. Her frost fire power surged uncontrollably, coating the cave walls in ice and dropping the temperature so low that the others had to wear every fur they owned. But finally, blessedly, she heard the first cry. "It's a girl," Mira announced, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped the tiny, squalling infant in soft pelts. 2 more followed. Another girl. And then a boy. "Triplets," Mira whispered. 2 daughters and a son. When they were all cleaned and wrapped, Mira placed them in Seraphina's arms. Seraphina looked down at her children and felt her heart shatter and reform in the same instant. They were perfect. The oldest girl had a shock of dark hair and her father's strong features. The second was smaller, delicate, with silver wisps of hair that marked her as pure frost fire. And the boy was somewhere between, with Seraphina's eyes and Allaric's determined chin. "Hello?" Seraphina whispered. "Hello, my beautiful babies." The triplets quieted at the sound of her voice. 3 pairs of eyes, still unfocused, turned toward her. "You need to name them," Toph said softly. Seraphina had thought about names for months. But now, looking at her children, she knew exactly what to call them. "Nova," she said, touching the eldest daughter's tiny hand. "Luna, for the frost fire daughter. And Orion for her son." "Strong names," Jack said from the doorway. "For strong pups." The pack crowded around, careful and reverent. They'd all become invested in these babies. Some of the wolves were crying. Others were smiling with pure joy. This was what the pack was supposed to be, Seraphina realized. Not politics and power, but this. Shared joy. Mutual protection. Love without conditions. "Welcome to Crystal Vale," Mira said to the triplets. "We've been waiting for you." The first weeks with newborn triplets were chaotic. Seraphina barely slept. The babies needed constant feeding, and with 3 of them, she was perpetually exhausted. But the pack helped. Everyone took turns rocking fussy infants, singing to them, or simply holding them so Seraphina could rest. Nova proved to be the boldest. She cried loudly when she wanted something and seemed to be studying everything with intense focus, even at just weeks old. Luna was quieter, more contemplative, and Orion was the charmer, always ready with a toothless smile. "They're going to be a handful," Seraphina said one evening as she nursed Luna while Mira rocked Orion. "The best things always are," Mira replied. It was Jax who brought the news 3 months after the triplets' birth. He returned from a scouting mission with a grave expression. "We have visitors coming. Important ones." Seraphina looked up from where she was playing with Nova. "What kind of visitors?" "Mystics. 3 of them. They say they need to speak with the Frostfire Wolf about a prophecy." Seraphina's blood ran cold. "Send them away." "I tried. They said, the prophecy concerns your children. They said if you don't hear them, the wolf clans will destroy themselves." She wanted to refuse. Wanted nothing to do with prophecies or mystics or anything that connected to the world beyond Crystal Vale. But the mention of her children changed everything. "Fine," she said, "but they come alone." And they're watched. The 3 mystics arrived the next day. They were ancient wolves, their faces lined with age, their eyes milky with wisdom. They moved slowly, leaning on staffs scarfed with runes. Despite their frailty, there was power in them. Seraphina could feel it. She met them in the main cave, Nova in her arms, and Luna and Orion sleeping nearby. The entire Crystal Vale pack was present, forming a protective circle. "Speak," Seraphina said, "and make it quick." The eldest mystic, a woman with silver hair that reached the ground, bowed her head. "We are honored to meet you, Frostfire Queen." "I'm not a queen. You are to us." And to the prophecy, the mystic's blind eyes somehow found Seraphina's face. "We have seen the future. Many possible futures. And in all of them, a great war is coming." "Wars are always coming," Seraphina said dismissively. "Not like this." The second mystic spoke, his voice like grinding stones. "This war will be between the wolf clans. Alpha against alpha, pack against pack. It will burn through our lands like wildfire and leave nothing but ashes. What does this have to do with my children?" The third mystic stepped forward. "Everything." The prophecy speaks of 3 heirs born of frost fire and alpha blood, born of rejection and exile, 3 who will either unite the clans or watch them fall. Serafina held Nova tighter. No, it is already written, the first mystic said gently. Your daughters and your son are marked by fate. When they come of age, they will be called to fulfill the prophecy. They are the only ones who can stop what's coming. They're babies. They don't have anything to do with clan politics, not yet. But they will. The mystic's voice was sad. We're sorry. We know you wanted to keep them safe. But hiding from destiny only delays it. Get out. Serafina's voice was shaking. Get out of my territory. There's more you need to know, the second mystic insisted. The prophecy requires. Frost erupted through the cave. The temperature plummeted. I spread across the floor in sharp spikes, forcing the mystics to stumble backward. Your children are special, Frostfire Queen, the first mystic called as they retreated. And special wolves cannot hide forever. When the time comes, you will have to choose your peace, or the survival of all wolf kind. Then they were gone. The cave fell silent, except for the sound of Luna beginning to fuss. Serafina sank to her knees, still clutching Nova. We don't listen to them, Mira said fiercely. Prophecies are just words. Your children can be whatever they want to be. But Serafina knew better. She'd spent her whole life trying to escape the prophecies about frost-fire wolves. And look where that had gotten her. Maybe you couldn't run from fate. Maybe all you could do was face it on your own terms. She looked down at Nova, who was chewing on her tiny fist and looking up at her mother with complete trust. I won't let them take you, Serafina whispered. I don't care what the prophecy says. You're mine. And no one is going to use you as pawns in their war. But even as she said it, she felt the weight of inevitability settling over her shoulders. The mystics were right about one thing. Special wolves couldn't hide forever, and her children were the most special of all. That night, Serafina stood outside the cave, watching the stars. Orion was strapped to her chest in a sling, sleeping peacefully. The girls were inside with Mira. I've kept us safe so far, she said to her sleeping son. Built a home. A pack. But it's not enough, is it? Eventually, the world will come for you. For your sisters. And I can't fight the whole world. Orion made a small sound in his sleep. His tiny hand curled around her finger. I need to make us stronger, Serafina decided. Crystal Vale needs to be more than just a refuge. It needs to be a force. Powerful enough that no one would dare threaten us. It was a turning point. Serafina had been content to hide, to stay small and unnoticed. But her children deserved better than a life of hiding. They deserved a kingdom. And she would build them one. Starting tomorrow, Crystal Vale would transform from a ragtag group of outcasts into something the wolf clans had never seen. A true pack, united not by blood or territory, but by choice and loyalty. Led by a frost-fire queen and her 3 prophesied heirs. But what was growing in the northern wilds a haven of outcasts, or the future that would make the old clans tremble. 5 years changed everything. Crystal Vale was no longer a collection of caves housing desperate outcasts. It had become a thriving settlement carved into the mountainside. Sturdy structures made of wood and stone stood where tents had been. Training grounds occupied the central clearing. Smoke rose from multiple hearths, carrying the scent of communal meals. The pack had grown too. Word spread through the rogue networks about a place where rejected wolves could find belonging. They came in trickles at first, then in streams. By the time Nova, Luna, and Orion turned 5, Crystal Vale numbered nearly 80 wolves. And at the center of it all was Serafina. She'd changed as much as her home. The frightened girl who'd fled Obsidian Peak was gone, replaced by a woman of steel and ice. She'd learned to wield her frost-fire power with precision. Learned to lead with firm compassion. Learned to make hard decisions and live with the consequences. Her pack called her queen. She'd stopped protesting the title. This morning she stood on the training grounds watching her children spar with Jax. At 5 years old, the triplets were already showing signs of greatness. Nova fought with fierce determination, her small wood unpracticed sword striking hard and fast. She had her father's tactical mind, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Her wolf form when she shifted was dark-furred and powerful. Luna was smaller, more delicate, but she'd inherited the full force of the frost fire gift. Her wolf form shimmered silver blue like Seraphina's, and when she got emotional, frost spread from her hands just like her mother. She was learning control, but it was a struggle. Orion was the balance between his sisters. Strong but thoughtful, quick but careful. His wolf was a beautiful blend of dark and silver fur, and he had a natural charisma that drew others to him. Again, Nova demanded after Jax disarmed her for the third time. "You're getting tired," Jax said. "Take a break." "I'm fine." But even as she spoke, Nova stumbled. Luna was at her sister's side immediately. "Nova, you need to rest. Don't tell me what to do." Nova snapped, jerking away. The sisters glared at each other. This had been happening more often lately. Nova pushing herself to exhaustion. Luna trying to protect her. Arguments erupting between them. "Enough," Seraphina called out. Both girls immediately stopped. They might argue with each other, but they never disobeyed their mother. Seraphina approached her children. "Nova, Jax is right. You've been training for 3 hours. Your body needs rest." "But I need to be strong," Nova protested. "You always say we need to be ready. Strength isn't just about fighting until you collapse. It's knowing your limits." Seraphina smoothed her daughter's sweat-dampened hair. "Real strength is having the wisdom to step back and recover so you can fight another day." Nova considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Orion, you've been practicing with the younger pups. How are they progressing?" Her son smiled. "Getting better. Fenwick can almost shift completely now. Just his tail keeps getting stuck." Seraphina laughed. "Good. Keep working with him." She turned to Luna. "And you, little Frost, let's work on your control. I felt you nearly freeze the water barrel earlier." Luna ducked her head. "I didn't mean to. I just got frustrated." "I know. That's why we practice." The afternoon was spent in individual training. Seraphina worked with Luna on channeling her frost fire power without letting emotions control it. It was the same struggle Seraphina had faced and still faced sometimes. Their power was tied to feeling. Anger made it sharp and dangerous. Fear made it wild. But calm focus made it precise and beautiful. "Imagine the cold as a part of you," Seraphina instructed. "Not something separate. It's like breathing. Natural. Busy." Luna closed her eyes, concentrating. Slowly, frost formed in her palm. It didn't explode outward or freeze everything nearby. Instead, it crystallized into a perfect snowflake, intricate and delicate. "I did it." Luna's eyes flew open. "You did." Seraphina hugged her daughter. "I'm so proud of you." That evening, as the pack gathered for the meal, a scout rushed in. "Queen Seraphina, we have a situation." The great hall fell silent. Seraphina set down her cup. "Report. There's a wolf at our border, requesting sanctuary." But the scout hesitated. "She says she's from Obsidian Peak." Every wolf in the hall turned to look at Seraphina. Obsidian Peak. The pack that had rejected her. That had thrown her away on her wedding night. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years. "Who is she?" Seraphina asked, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "She says her name is Marin. She's young, maybe 19. And she's..." The scout glanced at the triplets who were listening intently. "She's injured. Badly." Seraphina closed her eyes briefly. This was what she'd built Crystal Vale for. To give sanctuary to wolves who needed it. But Obsidian Peak. "Bring her in," she said carefully, "and have Mira prepare the healing room." Marin was carried in on a stretcher 20 minutes later. She was young, as the scout had said, pretty with copper-colored hair and a dusting of freckles. But her face was bruised, her arm bent at an unnatural angle, and her breathing was labored. "What happened to you?" Mira asked gently as she began examining the injuries. "Punishment," Marin whispered, "for refusing a mating bond." Seraphina's hands clenched. "They did this because you said no?" "The Alpha. He said I was being selfish. That the pack's needs came before my feelings." Marin's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to explain that the male he chose was cruel, that he'd hurt his previous mate. But no one listened. So they made an example of me." Rage, cold and terrible, flooded through Seraphina. The temperature in the room dropped. Easy, Mira murmured. The girl needs warmth, not a freeze. Serafina forced herself to breathe, to push the anger down, but it simmered beneath her skin, waiting. You're safe now, she told Marin. No one will hurt you here, and no one will ever force you into a bond you don't want. Thank you. Marin sobbed in relief. Thank you, Queen Serafina. As Mira set to work healing Marin's injuries, Serafina stepped outside. She found her children waiting, their small faces serious. Mama, is that pack bad? Orion asked. Serafina knelt to their level. She'd never told them the full story of their father. They knew they had won somewhere, knew he wasn't part of their lives. But they didn't know about the rejection, about Obsidian Peak. Maybe it was time they learned some of it. That pack, she said carefully, is where I came from. Before you were born. They made choices I didn't agree with. So I left, and I built something better. Something kinder. That's what Crystal Vale is. Did they hurt you? Nova's voice was fierce. They did. But it made me stronger. Strong enough to protect you. Strong enough to create a home where everyone is valued. Luna threw her arms around Serafina's neck. I'm glad you left them. I like our home. So am I, Little Frost. So am I. But as Serafina hugged her children, a plan began to form in her mind. Obsidian Peak hadn't changed. They were still cruel. Still punished wolves for wanting autonomy. Still valued power over compassion. And they were just one pack among many with the same poison. The mystics had been right. The war was coming. Serafina could feel it in the shifting winds. The old pack structures were failing. Alphas were becoming tyrants. Wolves were suffering. And her children prophesied as they would be caught in the middle of it. Unless she acted first. Over the next year, Serafina transformed Crystal Vale from a sanctuary into a statement. She sent emissaries to other packs, not the powerful central clans, but the smaller border packs. The ones who struggled under larger packs' domination. She offered alliances, trade agreements, mutual protection. Some accepted, others were suspicious. But slowly, a network began to form. Packs that had been isolated found common cause. Wolves who'd been voiceless found a champion. And at the center was the Frostfire Queen and her growing legend. Stories spread about a rejected mate who'd become more powerful than any alpha. About triplets who could unite the clans. About a place where strength was measured by loyalty, not cruelty. The major packs started to notice. Emissaries came from the eastern territories, from the southern marshlands, even from the central clans. They all wanted the same thing: to assess this upstart queen. To see if she was a threat or an opportunity. Serafina met with them all. She was diplomatic but firm. Crystal Vale would not bow to any alpha. Would not compromise its values. But they would be good neighbors to those who showed respect. It was during one of these meetings that she heard his name again. Alpha Allaric of Obsidian Peak is concerned about your growing influence, the emissary said. He was from one of the central packs, a polished wolf with calculating eyes. Serafina kept her expression neutral. Is he? He believes that the traditional pack structure is being undermined. That your unconventional methods are encouraging dissent. My methods, Serafina said coldly, are about treating wolves with dignity. If that undermines his authority, perhaps his authority deserves to be undermined. The emissary's eyebrows rose. Strong words, Queen Serafina. I'm not afraid of Allaric Black. And she wasn't. Not anymore. If he has concerns, he can bring them to me himself. Otherwise, you can tell him that Crystal Vale will continue exactly as we are. After the emissary left, Mira approached her. You're poking the bear, Mira said quietly. I'm drawing a line, Serafina corrected. For 6 years I've been building in secret, growing quietly. But we're strong enough now. It's time the world knew that rejected wolves can become queens. And that queens don't answer to alphas who threw them away. And if he comes for you, Serafina smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. Then he'll discover that the fragile girl he rejected no longer exists. And in her place is someone who won't break so easily. That night, she stood on the wall of Crystal Vale, looking south toward territories she'd once called home. Her children found her there as they often did. At 6 years old now, They were perceptive enough to sense when she was troubled. "Tell us about her father," Nova said. It wasn't the first time they'd asked, but it was the first time Serafina felt ready to answer. She looked at her 3 beautiful children. Strong, brave, kind. Everything their father should have been. "Your father," she said slowly, "is Alpha Allaric Black of the Obsidian Peak Pack. He was my fated mate. And on our wedding night, his council convinced him that my bloodline was dangerous. So he rejected me, cast me out. He never knew about you." The triplets absorbed this in silence. "Does he know now?" Orion asked. "I don't know. Maybe. The rumors about me have spread far, but I've never confirmed your existence to anyone outside Crystal Vale." "Why not?" Luna's voice was small. Serafina knelt and gathered her children close. "Because you're mine. My treasures. My purpose. And I was afraid that if the world knew about you, they'd try to use you. The prophecy makes you valuable, and valuable things are always in danger." "But we're not things," Nova said fiercely. "We're wolves. We can fight." "I know, little warrior. But I'm your mother. It's my job to protect you, even from destiny." "We're not afraid," Orion said. And looking at her children, Serafina believed them. They were growing up strong, confident, and broken by the world that had tried to break her. Maybe that was enough. Maybe when the time came, they would be ready. But then the Frostfire Queen had risen from exile. But would the world accept her crown? Or would they come to take it by force? The letter arrived on a winter morning 2 years later. Serafina was in the Great Hall settling a dispute between 2 pack members when a messenger wolf staggered through the gates. He was exhausted, covered in snow, and bore the neutral markings of a clan courier. "Message for Queen Serafina," he gasped. "From the Grand Council." The hall went silent. The Grand Council, the governing body of all wolf clans. Representatives from the 5 major territories who met only when matters affected all wolves. Serafina had never dealt with them directly. Crystal Vale existed outside their traditional authority. "Give it here," she said. The scroll was sealed with 5 different wax marks, 1 for each territory. Serafina broke the seals and read. Her expression didn't change, but inside, ice spread through her veins. "What is it?" Jax asked. "A summons." Serafina's voice was flat. "The Grand Council demands my presence. They want to discuss the matter of the Frostfire line, its impact on interpack stability. Near accursed. It's a trap. Probably." Serafina read further. "They've granted me safe passage, guaranteed by all 5 territories." She looked up. "And they specifically mention that they know about my children." The hall erupted in angry voices. "Don't go," Tove shouted. "They'll use this to attack us, or to take the triplets." Someone else yelled. Serafina raised her hand, and silence fell instantly. 8 years of leadership had given her that kind of authority. "I'm going," she said. "Serafina." Mira started. "I'm going," she repeated firmly. "Because if I don't, they'll use my refusal as justification to declare Crystal Vale rogue. They'll unite the packs against us. We've grown strong, but we can't fight the entire wolf world." "Then we go with you," Jack said. "No, I'll take a small escort. 5 wolves. The rest of you stay here and protect the pack." She paused. "Protect my children." Nova, Luna, and Orion had been listening from the corner. At 8 years old now, they were old enough to understand danger, old enough to be afraid, that they were also their mother's children. "We should come too," Nova said, stepping forward. "The letter mentioned us. We should be there." "Absolutely not. Mama, she's right." Orion joined his sister. "They already know we exist. Hiding us won't change that. But if we come, if they see us, maybe they'll understand we're not a threat." Luna nodded, frost sparkling at her fingertips. "We can show them we're good wolves. That the prophecy doesn't make us dangerous." Serafina wanted to refuse, wanted to lock her children in the safest part of Crystal Vale and never let them near politics or councils or anyone who might hurt them. But they were right. The world already knew about the triplets, and hiding them would only make the council more suspicious. "Fine," she said, the word tasting like ash. "You come. But you stay close to me. You speak only when spoken to." And if anything feels wrong, you run. Understand?" All three nodded solemnly. The journey to the council grounds took 5 days. They traveled south through territories Serafina hadn't seen in 8 years. The landscape was familiar and foreign at once. She recognized landmarks from her youth, but everything felt smaller somehow, less intimidating. She'd changed, grown beyond the girl who'd walked these paths. The escort she'd chosen was formidable. Jax, Mira, Tove, Rune, and a fierce warrior named Kilda. All loyal, all willing to die for their queen and her children. The triplets rode in a wagon for part of the journey, though they preferred to run in wolf form when the terrain allowed. They were excited despite the danger. This was their first time leaving Crystal Vale, their first glimpse of the wider world. "Is that Obsidian Peak?" Nova asked as they passed near familiar borders. "Close to it," Serafina said. "We're skirting the territory." "Do you think he knows we're here?" Luna asked quietly. "Our father?" "I don't know, Little Frost." But Allaric knew. In Obsidian Peak, Alpha Allaric Black stood in his council chamber holding a report from his scouts. Serafina was traveling to the council grounds, with 3 children. 8 years. 8 years since he rejected her. 8 years of trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. 8 years of his wolf howling in protest at the severed bond. And now she was back. A queen, with children who were rumored to fulfill an ancient prophecy. "The ages match," Malachi said quietly beside him. He was older now, his silver hair white, but his eyes were still sharp. "If she was pregnant when she left, they're mine." Allaric's voice was hollow. He'd suspected for years. The timing was too perfect, and the descriptions of the children rare as they were mentioned traits that could only have come from both their bloodlines. 3 heirs born of rejection, just as the prophecy had described. "You should go to the council gathering," Malachi said. "See them for yourself." "And say what?" "Sorry I rejected their mother and drove her into exile." "You could claim them as your heirs. It would strengthen Obsidian Peak's position." Allaric turned on his advisor, eyes blazing gold. "They're not political tools." No, Malachi's eyebrow rose. "Then what are they?" "Because right now, they're the key to a prophecy that could reshape the wolf world. And their mother is building power that rivals the major territories. If you don't act, someone else will." Allaric wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because Malachi was right. The council grounds were neutral territory, a vast clearing surrounded by ancient standing stones. When Serafina's group arrived, dozens of other packs were already present. She saw the territorial markers: the eastern clans, the southern marsh packs, the western mountain wolves, and yes, the northern territories, including representatives from Obsidian Peak. Her heart clenched, but she kept walking. The triplets stayed close, their eyes wide as they took in the gathering. This was more wolves than they'd ever seen in one place. A herald announced their arrival. Queen Serafina of Crystal Vale and her heirs. Heirs, not children. The word was deliberate. Serafina walked into the circle of stones with her head high. The triplets flanked her, Nova on her right, Luna on her left, Orion slightly behind. Her escort formed a protective ring. 5 wolves sat in ceremonial places. The Grand Council. Each represented one of the major territories. The eldest spoke first. "Queen Serafina, we appreciate your attendance." "I came as requested," Serafina said coolly, "though I question why a sovereign pack needs permission to exist from a council we never joined." Murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves. "Crystal Vale exists because of the stability we've maintained," another council member said. This one was younger, sharp-eyed. "Your pack is built from rogues and rejects. That makes you our concern." "My pack is built from wolves who deserved better than they received," Serafina countered. "And last I checked, offering sanctuary wasn't a crime. It is when it destabilizes other packs." The third council member leaned forward. "We've had reports. Wolves leaving established packs to join yours. Taking resources. Creating tensions. Wolves choosing to leave oppressive situations for better ones," Serafina corrected. "I don't force anyone to come to Crystal Vale. They choose us because we treat them with respect." The fourth council member, a woman with kind eyes, spoke more gently. "We're not here to attack you, Queen Serafina. We're here because of the prophecy." and because your children represent something that could change everything. All eyes turned to Nova, Luna, and Orion. The triplets stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. Seraphina's heart swelled with pride. My children, she said firmly, are not subjects for council discussion. They're 8 years old. They're the prophesied heirs, the 5th council member said. Born of frost, fire, and alpha blood. Born of rejection. 3 who'll either unite the clans or watch them fall. You can't deny this. I deny nothing. But I won't let you use them as pawns. No one wants to use them. The kind-eyed woman stood. We want to protect them. The prophecy speaks of a great war. If we don't prepare, if we don't work together. Then work together. Seraphina interrupted. Stop oppressing your pack members. Stop punishing wolves for wanting autonomy. Create the kind of stability that doesn't require a prophecy to maintain. My children shouldn't have to save you from yourselves. Silence fell. It was broken by a voice Seraphina hadn't heard in 8 years. She's right. Allaric Black stepped into the circle. Seraphina's breath caught. He looked the same. Older, maybe more careworn, but still devastatingly handsome. Still the wolf who'd promised her forever and then shattered her world. Their eyes met across the circle. For a moment, the bond wound, scarred but still present, flared to life. Pain and longing and rage all tangled together. Then Seraphina looked away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of her pain. Not anymore. Alpha Allaric, the eldest council member, said, You have something to add? I do. Allaric's gaze moved to the triplets. Seraphina saw the moment recognition hit him. Saw his eyes widen. Saw his hands clench. He knew. Those children, he said quietly, are mine. The gathering erupted in shocked voices. Nova, Luna, and Orion stared at the wolf who just claimed them. Their faces were unreadable, but Seraphina could feel their tension. You have no right, Seraphina said, her voice deadly calm. You rejected me. You threw me away. You have no claim on them. I didn't know. Allaric stepped closer. I didn't know you were pregnant. Would it have mattered? The question was a blade. Would you have kept me if you'd known? Or would the council have just declared my children dangerous too? Allaric flinched. That's what I thought. Seraphina turned back to the Grand Council. We're done here. I've answered your summons. My children and I are leaving. Wait. The kind-eyed woman raised her hand. Please, we're not your enemy. The tensions are rising across all territories. Small conflicts are escalating. If the prophecy is real, if war is coming, we need to be prepared. We need your help. Why should I help packs that would have rejected me just like Obsidian Peak did? Because not all of us would have. The woman's voice was gentle. Because some of us believe in what you're building. And because your children deserve a world that's worth inheriting. Seraphina wanted to refuse. Wanted to take her children and return to Crystal Vale and never look back. But the woman was right. If war came, it wouldn't stop at Crystal Vale's borders. Her children would be caught in it whether she helped or not. I'll make you a deal, Seraphina said. I'll work with the council. Share information. Help mediate conflicts. But Crystal Vale remains sovereign. We bow to no alpha. We follow no territory's laws but our own. And my children are never, ever used as political bargaining chips. Agreed? The council members conferred quietly. Finally, they nodded. Agreed, the eldest said. Then we have an accord. Seraphina turned to leave, then paused. She looked at Allaric one last time. And you, stay away from my children. You lost the right to call them yours 8 years ago. She walked away, her children and her escort following. Behind her, Allaric watched them go, and for the first time in 8 years, the Alpha of Obsidian Peak allowed himself to feel the full weight of his mistake. As seen, the Frostfire Queen had claimed her place in the wolf world. But had the summons brought answers, or awakened something far more dangerous? The weeks following the council gathering were tense. Seraphina threw herself into her new role as mediator, traveling between territories to resolve disputes. It was exhausting work. Alphas were proud and territorial. Getting them to compromise was like trying to teach stone to bend. But slowly, it was working. Small conflicts were resolved. Trade agreements were established. The threat of war receded inch by inch. At Crystal Vale, the triplets were changing too. At 8 years old, they were beginning to come into their powers. Nova showed signs of extraordinary strength and tactical brilliance. Luna's frost fire gift was growing, sometimes manifesting in beautiful displays of ice sculpture, other times in dangerous bursts when her emotions ran high. Orion was developing a rare gift for sensing others' emotions and intentions and empathy that made him a natural leader. They trained hard, studied harder, and asked constant questions about the prophecy, about their father, about the world beyond Crystal Vale. Seraphina answered what she could, but some questions had no good answers. It was Nova who brought up the inevitable. "I want to meet him," she said one evening. "Our father." They were in Seraphina's private chambers. All 3 triplets had come, which meant they'd planned this conversation. Seraphina set down the report she'd been reading. "Why?" "Because he's part of who we are," Orion said quietly. "You've told us about him, about what happened, but we want to understand for ourselves." "He's dangerous," Seraphina said. "Not because he's violent, but because he's weak. He let others make his choices for him. He rejected what he claimed to love because he was afraid. But he's still our father," Luna said, her voice small. "Doesn't that mean something?" Seraphina looked at her children. They were so young, too young to be dealing with this, but they were also prophesied heirs, children of 2 powerful bloodlines, and they deserved the truth. "He is your father," she said carefully, "and if you want to meet him, I won't stop you. But I need you to understand something. Allaric Black chose his pack over me, over us. That's who he is. Don't expect him to suddenly become someone different." "We won't," Nova promised. "We just need to know." 2 weeks later, Seraphina sent a message to Obsidian Peak. The response came quickly. Allaric agreed to meet on neutral ground. Just him and the children, with Seraphina and a small escort present. The meeting was arranged in a clearing halfway between Crystal Vale and Obsidian Peak. Seraphina arrived early with the triplets. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her expression calm for her children's sake. When Allaric appeared through the trees, she felt the bond wound flare again. 8 years, and it still hurt to look at him. The triplets stood frozen, staring at the wolf who shared their blood. Allaric stopped a respectful distance away. He looked between the 3 children, his expression a mixture of wonder and pain. "Nova, Luna, Orion," he said quietly. "I've wanted to meet you for so long. Then why didn't you come sooner?" Nova's voice was hard. Of the 3, she'd inherited the most of Seraphina's protectiveness. "Because your mother asked me to stay away. And she had every right." "You rejected her," Orion said. "It wasn't a question." "I did." Alaric's voice was steady, but Seraphina could hear the pain beneath. "I made a terrible mistake. I let fear and duty override what my heart knew was right. I've regretted it every day since." "Regret doesn't fix anything," Nova said. "No, it doesn't." Allaric met his daughter's eyes. "But I hope. Maybe I can be part of your lives going forward. If you let me." The triplets looked at each other, that silent communication they developed over the years. It was Luna who spoke. "We don't need a father who rejected our mother. But maybe we could have someone who respects what she's built, who sees us as who we are, not what some prophecy says we should be." "I can do that," Allaric said immediately. "I want to do that." "Then prove it." Nova stepped forward. "Help Mama. Help Crystal Vale. Show us you've changed." Allaric looked at Seraphina. "Would you accept my help?" Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. But she saw the hope in her children's eyes, saw that they needed this, needed to believe their father could be someone worth knowing. "Crystal Vale could use allies," she said carefully. "If Obsidian Peak wants to establish a formal alliance, we can discuss terms." "Whatever terms you want," Allaric said. "Don't make promises you can't keep," Seraphina warned. "Your council won't like this." "Then I'll change my council." His voice was firm. "I've spent 8 years letting others dictate my choices. That's done. From now on, I live according to what's right, not what's comfortable." It was the right thing to say. But Seraphina had learned not to trust words. "We'll see," she said. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Allaric kept his word. He restructured Obsidian Peak's council, removing the wolves who'd pushed for Serafina's rejection. He established trade agreements with Crystal Vale that benefited both packs. He mediated disputes in the region, using his influence to support the changes Serafina was trying to make. And slowly, carefully, he built relationships with his children. He visited regularly, brought gifts, told stories, taught them about their alpha heritage. Serafina watched with mixed feelings. Part of her was glad her children had a father, but part of her would never forgive Allaric for the years he'd stolen from them. "He's trying," Mira said one evening as they watched Allaric spar with Orion in the training yard. "I know. Are you going to let him keep trying?" Serafina was quiet for a long moment. "For the children, yes, they deserve to know him. But for me, the bond is broken, Mira. Some things can't be repaired, even fated bonds, especially those, because they were supposed to be unbreakable. And he broke ours with words and cowardice." Serafina turned away from the window. "I've built a life without him. A good life. I don't need him anymore, but needn't want were different things." And late at night, when Serafina lay alone in her chambers, she sometimes wondered what might have been. If Allaric had been braver, if the council hadn't interfered, if they'd raised their children together. Then she'd remember the pain of that wedding night, the humiliation, the loneliness of those first months in exile, and she'd remind herself that she was stronger alone. The peace lasted almost a year. Then the attacks began. Small at first, raiders hitting border packs. Supply lines disrupted. Isolated, violent incidents. But they escalated quickly. "It's coordinated," Jax reported grimly. "Someone's organizing these attacks, trying to destabilize the territories." "Who?" Serafina demanded. "We don't know. But whoever it is, they're good. They hit fast, leave no trail, and they're specifically targeting packs that have allied with you." Serafina's blood ran cold. "They're trying to punish wolves for working with Crystal Vale, or trying to start the war the prophecy mentioned." The mystic's words echoed in Serafina's mind. "A great war is coming, and your children are the only ones who can stop it." She'd thought they had more time, thought she could keep her children safe a little longer. But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. The first direct attack on Crystal Vale came 3 weeks later. Serafina woke to alarms and shouts. Smoke filled the air. She bolted from her bed, already shifting partially, her frost fire power rising instinctively. "The children?" she shouted to Mira, who was running through the halls, already secured in the safe room. Serafina ran to the walls. What she saw made her heart stop. An army, at least 100 wolves, all in black dyed furs, faces covered. They breached the outer defenses and were fighting their way toward the main compound. "Who are they?" Tove shouted over the chaos. "I don't know." Serafina's hands glowed with cold light. "But they're not leaving here alive." She leapt from the wall, landing in the middle of the attackers. Frost exploded outward. Wolves screamed as ice encased their legs. Serafina fought with precision and fury, her power and her combat skills combining into something terrifying. But there were so many of them. And then she saw it. A group breaking away from the main fight, headed straight for the compound where the safe room was hidden. They were after her children. Serafina ran. She was faster than them, her desperation lending her speed. She reached the compound just as the attackers broke through the door. Crystal Vale wolves were fighting inside. Jax was there, bleeding but standing. So was Kilda. They formed a protective barrier in front of the safe room. But the attackers kept coming. Serafina unleashed everything. The temperature plummeted. I spread across every surface. Her eyes blazed silver blue, and her hands moved in patterns she didn't consciously know, as if her frostfire ancestors were guiding her. A blizzard erupted inside the compound. When it cleared, every attacker was frozen solid. Not dead, but immobilized, trapped in ice that would take hours to thaw. Serafina staggered, the power draining from her. "The children," she gasped. Jax opened the safe room. Nova, Luna, and Orion emerged. They were unharmed, but their eyes were wide with shock. "Mama!" Luna ran to her. Serafina caught her daughter, holding her tight, the other to join the embrace. "You're safe," Serafina whispered. You're safe. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. This was just the beginning. The war had found them, and nothing would ever be safe again. The question is, who had sent an army to steal the prophesied children? And would the Frostfire Queen's power be enough to protect them from what came next? The interrogations took all night. Seraphina personally questioned every captured attacker. Most refused to talk, but eventually one broke. We were hired, the wolf admitted, by someone from the Central Territories. They paid us to take the 3 children. Said they were too dangerous to be left with a rogue queen. Who hired you? Seraphina's voice was ice. I don't know. We never saw their faces. All communication was through intermediaries. But Seraphina had her suspicions. Someone on the Grand Council. Someone who feared what the triplets represented. Someone who wanted to control the prophecy rather than let it unfold naturally. She sent messages to every allied pack. Called in every favor. Within 3 days, she'd assembled enough evidence to demand another council gathering. This time she wouldn't be summoned. She would summon them. The council reconvened, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Seraphina stood in the center of the circle, her 3 children beside her. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood representatives from 40 packs. Small packs, border packs, but also some of the mid-tier territories. All of them allied with Crystal Vale. All of them tired of the old ways. Someone on this council, Seraphina said without preamble, hired wolves to attack Crystal Vale. To kidnap my children. I have proof. She presented the evidence. Testimonies from the captured attackers. Financial records her network had uncovered. A trail that led back to one of the Central Territories. The eldest council member's face paled. These are serious accusations. They're facts. Seraphina's eyes blazed. And I'm done pretending that the old power structures work. You've had centuries to create a just system. Instead, you've built hierarchies that reward cruelty and punish compassion. You've let alphas become tyrants and called it tradition. You can't overthrow the council. One member sputtered. I'm not overthrowing anything. I'm offering a choice. Seraphina gestured to the packs behind her. These wolves and hundreds more have chosen a different way. A way where strength is measured by loyalty and wisdom, not domination. Where wolves have autonomy over their own lives. Where children aren't pawns in political games. The prophecy, someone started. The prophecy, Seraphina interrupted, speaks of my children uniting the clans. But it doesn't say how. Maybe it's not through force or politics. Maybe it's through example. Through building something better and inviting others to join. She turned to address the entire gathering, not just the council. I'm not asking you to bow to me. I'm asking you to stand with me. To create a new council. One that represents all wolves, not just the powerful. One that protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. One that earns respect instead of demanding it. Silence fell. Then, one by one, wolves began to step forward, joining the group behind Seraphina. It wasn't everyone. Some territories remained loyal to the old ways. But enough joined that the message was clear. The wolf world was changing. And it was changing because a rejected mate had refused to stay broken. The eldest council member stood for a moment. Seraphina thought he would fight. But instead, he bowed his head. Perhaps, he said quietly, it's time for old wolves like me to step aside. Let new leadership guide us into a new era. One by one, the other council members agreed. A new council was formed. Representatives from all types of packs, including Crystal Vale. The power structure shifted from centralized control to distributed cooperation. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. But it was better. As the gathering dispersed, Allaric approached Seraphina. You did it, he said. You changed everything. We did it, Seraphina corrected, gesturing to the wolves around her. This was never just about me. But you started it. You had the courage to walk away from what was broken and build something new. Allaric hesitated. I should have had that courage 8 years ago. Yes, you should have. Seraphina's voice was soft but firm. You can't change the past, Allaric. All you can do is be better going forward. I know. And I will be. For our children, if nothing else. Allaric looked at the triplets who were laughing with other young wolves their age. They were 9 now, growing so fast. Soon they'd be teenagers, then adults, then taking their places in this new world they'd helped create. They don't need you to be perfect, she told Allaric. They just need you to be present, consistent, honest. Can you do that? I can. He paused. What about you? What do you need? It was a loaded question. Serafina considered how to answer. The truth was, she didn't need Allaric, hadn't needed him for years. She'd built a life, a pack, a legacy without him. But need and forgiveness were different things. I need you to be a good father, she said finally. I need you to support the changes we're making. And I need you to accept that what we had, the bond we lost, is gone. It can't be recovered. Pain flickered across Allaric's face, but he nodded. I understand. Good. Serafina turned to leave, then paused. But maybe, someday, we can be friends, co-parents who respect each other. That's the best I can offer. It's more than I deserve, Allaric said quietly. As Serafina walked away, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The bond wound that had ached for 9 years was finally, truly healed. Not because the bond was restored, but because she'd made peace with its loss. She'd been rejected, exiled, left pregnant and alone, and she turned that pain into power, that exile into a kingdom, that loneliness into a family of her choosing. The triplets ran to her, their faces bright with excitement. Mama, Elder Fenwick wants to teach us about the old histories, Orion said. And Toph said we can help plan the next gathering, Nova added. Luna simply hugged Serafina tight, frost sparkling harmlessly at her fingertips. Serafina held her children close and looked out over the gathering of wolves. So many packs, so many wolves, all coming together to build something better. The prophecy had said her children would either unite the clans or watch them fall. They'd chosen unity, but not through conquest or forced alliances. Through compassion, through creating a world where all wolves wanted to belong. Come on, Serafina said to her children. Let's go home. Crystal Vale waited, and beyond it, a future full of possibilities. She'd been rejected on her wedding night, cast out carrying a secret that should have destroyed her. Instead, it had made her a queen, and her children, those precious triplets born of rejection and exile, had become the bridge between the old world and the new. Not because prophecy demanded it, but because love, loyalty, and the refusal to break had forged them into something extraordinary. The Frostfire Queen and her heirs, a family that had changed the world. 10 years later, Serafina stood on the walls of Crystal Vale watching the sunrise. The settlement had grown into a true city. Wolves from every territory lived here now, drawn by the promise of equality and respect. The triplets, now 19, were preparing to embark on their own journeys. Nova was becoming a warrior of legendary skill. Luna had mastered her Frostfire gift and was teaching others. Orion was a gifted diplomat, already mediating conflicts between distant packs. They were everything Serafina had hoped they'd become. Strong, kind, wise beyond their years. Proud? Mira asked, joining her on the wall. Beyond words. You should be. You raised them well. Serafina smiled. We raised them well. All of Crystal Vale. It was true. The triplets belonged to the entire pack. They'd been raised by dozens of wolves, each contributing wisdom and love. That was the true strength of what they'd built. Not one leader, but a community. They're leaving soon, Serafina said softly. They'll come back. I know. But it's still hard. Mira squeezed her shoulder. That's parenthood. Loving them enough to let them go. Serafina watched her children in the courtyard below, laughing and sparring and living the lives she'd fought so hard to give them. She'd been rejected, broken, left with nothing but 3 tiny heartbeats and a determination to survive. And she built a kingdom from that pain. Not for revenge, though she'd been tempted. Not for power, though she'd claimed it. But for love. For her children. For every wolf who'd ever been told they weren't enough. The Frostfire Queen and her prophesied heirs. Proof that the broken could become unbreakable. That the rejected could become irreplaceable. And that sometimes the greatest love stories weren't about bonds restored, but about the strength to forge new ones from the ashes of the old. Serafina smiled as the sun rose over her kingdom. She was enough. She'd always been enough. And that was the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed the epic journey of Seraphina, Nova, Luna, and Orion, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Do you think Allaric deserved to be forgiven? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories from the Moonlight Mates Library. Sweet dreams.